The November 26, 2019 meeting of the Transportation Committee will now come to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Hebert. Here. Chairman Howland.
Here.
Mr. Lightfoot. Mr. Morelli. Here. Mr. Rockow. Here. Mr. Shepherd is excused. Mr. Zale. Here.
Is there anyone signed up for the public forum?
There is not.
Is there anyone present who's not signed up to speak who would like to address this committee? Please show Mr. Lightfoot is in attendance. Now I'd like to introduce Robert Franklin, Chief Financial Officer of the Monroe County, who is here to present the 2020 proposed budget, Monroe County budget, as it pertains to the Transportation Committee. We will have a question and answer period following the presentation. Bob, congratulations. I'm praying for you.
Never say no to a good prayer. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I promise, 2 minutes. 2 minutes and we're done. 2020 budget presentation as it pertains to the Transportation Committee. I'd like to start with an overview of our Department of Transportation. Appropriations in the 2020 proposed budget are increasing by about $1 million. Just real quick, just a couple highlights. A vacancy factor was applied to some salaries within the department, in addition to reductions for overtime, reductions in temporary help, and longevity due to staff turnover, offset some increases in the contractual services area and increases in supplies and materials. I'll also note a reduction in debt service, roughly a little more than 300 grand, help absorb those increases in contractual costs and supply costs. Speaking of debt service, as you go through the budget, you'll no doubt notice the use of appropriated fund balance. As I commented last night, the use of fund balance this year specifically relates to our use of our reserve for bonded debt. These are bonded dollars and for capital funds ran in a prior year, which perhaps the expenses came in less than what we borrowed, or perhaps some unexpected aid came in to reimburse our expenses. Those funds must be transferred to our debt service fund, specifically reserved for bonded debt, and must be used only for that capital fund's future debt service. And finally, in my rounding out my 2 minutes, our local bus company, RGRTA. It's a state public authority. Of course, New York State requires the local municipality to provide local funding. This $3.5 million in our budget really is unchanged from the prior several years, to be honest with you. So, Mr. Chairman, that really concludes the presentation. Happy to answer questions back at the admin table.
I stole your chair, didn't I? Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Are there any questions from the committee regarding the transportation budget? Mr. Lightfoot.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for recognizing me to ask these questions. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the administration regarding our Transportation Committee. Mr. Chairman, through 2020, on page 333 for the department overview, under the appropriation by sub-object, asset equipment, why is it going from 42,000 to 199,000 in 2020?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This particular budget line item would include for 2020 the purchase of 7 new vehicles for the division, for the department.
Thank you so much. 7 new vehicles. Will these vehicles be any special, or are they just regular 4x4 trucks or something similar to that?
Mr. Chairman, this is a combination of, mainly it's passenger vehicles, would include maybe 1 or 2 pickup trucks, but primarily passenger vehicles.
Thank you so much. To you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Holland, thank you so much. On page 33, as we continue on the same page, appropriated fund balance was referred to as appropriated debt service fund balance in 2019.
Yes, Mr.
So
Chairman.
Is this the same or something has changed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar to a comment and question last night, that is correct. 2019 budget book did identify this as appropriated debt service fund balance. We are just trying to be a little more consistent throughout the pages of our budget book. We are referencing this strictly as appropriated fund balance, so I'm trying to make extra effort to, within my presentations, to identify the use of fund balance specifically as our reserve for bonded debt. Last year's amount of $1.734 million also came from the debt service fund, Mr. Chairman. That was not specifically a reserve for bonded debt, but rather the unrestricted portion of our debt service fund.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move on to the some more additional questions, sir. Thank you so much. On page 336, under administration planning, why do we anticipate an increase in asset equipment, and exactly what is it?
Mr. Chairman, this division includes the purchase of 1 passenger vehicle. It's a Ford Escape. That's 1 vehicle out of the 7 previously inquired about, Mr. Chairman.
So is it a duplication, to you, Mr. Chairman, of what we already found on 333 for vehicles, or?
Good question, Mr. Chairman. Page 333 actually is the department budget. That is the primary focus of the legislature. As you get into the pages, 334, 5, 6, 7, 8, those really provide just additional detail of the various divisions within the department. So,
Thank you.
yes, Mr. Chairman, this is 1 vehicle out of the 7 identified on page 333.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, through you, Mr. Chairman, on the same particular page, we are, what are some of the contractual services that we are acquiring?
Mr. Chairman, on this particular page for administration planning, the increase for contractual services is primarily for travel to statewide conferences and membership in statewide associations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Administration. I find that conferences are important for us in learning. So education is never enough. Thank you so much. Through you, Mr. Chairman, continuing on my dissertation of questions, Mr. Chairman, through you, continuing on page 336, under personal services, Mr. Chairman, through you to the administration, personal services is declining about 21%, but the employee benefits are only declining 2%. and my notes tell me that page 560 has more details, but is there a rationale for this? How can this be?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for referencing page 560, which provides greater detail than page 336. Included in this reduction is a reduction in temporary help, which may not be overly significant dollar amount, but as temporary help reduces, there often are not benefits associated with that. But I will also identify, Mr. Chairman, that in addition to the lower temporary help, which reduces personnel services, there is staff turnover resulting in a vacancy and the application of a vacancy factor for salaries. And while we often apply a vacancy factor in salaries, we do not take a corresponding factor for employee benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I'll let my colleague.
Legislator Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, under Traffic Operations and Permits, page 337, can you explain why there is a $100,000 increase in contractual services and what services those are?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The primary reason for the increase in contractual services relates to the upcoming purchase of new epoxy-based pavement markings. It would be like the lines striped down the road or the stop marks.
And is that something, through you, Mr. Chairman, that we don't do in-house?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, our equipment that we use only installs regular waterborne paint, and the application of the epoxy materials is something that we need to go out for a vendor. So this would be a vendor service trying to apply those more durable materials on some of our higher volume roads where we won't have to be out there painting every year, so that we can get 3 or 4 years out of them for increased durability and put our guys where we can better apply our materials.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, is this a requirement or simply a preference that the county is undertaken? Like, I guess.
Through you,
Go ahead.
excuse me. Through you, Mr. Chairman, it is not a requirement, it is our preference.
Okay, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, on the same page, can you explain why there is an increase in debt service?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This is the particular division where we are running our capital funds for the new expressway lighting projects. I believe there are 4, perhaps 5 of them. That's where you'll find the debt service for those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Chairman, again on the same page, what is the appropriated fund balance and why does it show an increase?
Mr. Chairman, this $243,000 and change is appropriated fund balance that we are drawing from our reserve for bonded debt. The greater detail of the capital funds for which this might apply can be supplied. We generally don't break those out. You'll find all the detail of debt service in the section of the budget book for debt service.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, same page, other revenue is mentioned. Can you tell us what that is?
Mr. Chairman, primarily this other revenue is derived from our charges to capital funds for sign fabrication and installation, and that's primarily from the pedestrian safety action plan.
And through you, that sign fabrication is something we do here at the county in-house?
We do, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Chairman, highway engineering and operations, if I could, page 339. Could you explain why the interdepartmental chargebacks have increased by 300%?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, that's a big one. Throughout this budget book and in several departments, primarily DOT, DES, and probably Parks, we've eliminated from the budget our chargeback for, our line item for project chargebacks. That would be our staff time and effort, where in prior years we may have charged that staff time and effort to a particular capital fund. It's not the best practice, Mr. Chairman, and we'd like to eliminate that going forward from the budget.
Okay, so this is just a change in terms of budget as a whole.
It is, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, page 339. Can you explain what the provision capital project is?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There's actually 3 capital projects in the CIP. Traffic engineering, spot improvements, and the project for City of Rochester traffic features. Those three projects, which I can tell you, $500,000, $350,000, and $450,000 combined for $1.25 million. So it's those three capital funds.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chairman, this is cash capital being utilized, correct?
Mr. Chairman, in prior years, we had borrowed for these particular projects, but because they are annually recurring of roughly the same dollar amount, it just makes better financial sense to switch these to cash capital.
Perfect, makes sense. Through you, Mr. Chairman, page 339, can you tell us what is the appropriated fund balance and why it is down about approximately 1.4 million?
So that's a good question, Mr. Chairman. For the 2020 proposed budget, the $371,000 and change is specifically coming from the county's reserve for bonded debt. Last year, in the amended budget for 2019, $1.734 million, that was not from the reserve for bonded debt, but came from the unrestricted portion of our debt service fund.
Perfect, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, same page, why aren't there any service chargebacks line items like in the 2017-2018 proposed budget? And do these lines differ from the interdepartmental chargebacks which you mentioned earlier?
Another good question, Mr. Chairman. In prior budget books, we had separate lines for interdepartmental charges and service chargebacks that invariably led to some human error. Basically, you will find all of those charges, those are all the 9,000 charges, towards the back of the budget book in the appropriation detail. I can reference you to page 563, which is specifically for traffic operations and permits. You'll see a variety of 9,000 chargebacks, some of them negative, most of them positive, and we're just trying to eliminate the human error in separating the specific negative charges from the specific positive charges.
Perfect, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Chairman, on the same page, if I could, the asset equipment line has changed significantly from the 2017-2018 budgets. Can you explain the significant increase and how it relates to this proposed budget?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This particular line item, $93,000, accounts for 3 of the vehicles previously identified of the 7 back on page 333.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could, to traffic signal engineering and operations on page 341, could you explain to me why the 2019 amended budget for interdepartmental charges is negative $6,800, but projected to be a cost of over $100,000 in 2020?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This particular division had quite a bit of negative expense for project chargebacks. 2019 amended, signal operation. Yeah, this particular budget had a significant amount, it is $165,000 in the amended budget. The elimination of that budget line causes the entire section to go positive, so that's why you see the big swing.
Okay. And I'm sorry, you said there were negative expenses associated with that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Project chargebacks, in my previous answer, it represents our own staff time and effort on our work on capital projects, which departments in the past have charged the capital fund. I suggest that is not a good operating practice. Salaries, our time and effort, that's accounted for in the operating budget, and there's, in my opinion, not a good practice to be taking those operating expenses and moving them to a capital fund.
Makes sense. And when you say the department's time, are you specifically referencing the transportation's time, or does that have to do with the finance department's time associated with these projects?
Mr. Chairman, that specifically would be employees in DOT
Okay.
who contribute to the project.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. Through you, Mr. Chairman, page 341, why don't we predict any state aid for this division?
Page 341, Mr. Chairman.
Correct.
Federal aid or state aid?
This is state aid in particular.
Well, we do actually have state aid. Page 341, we identify that as charges to other governments.
Okay.
$223,000. That really represents our reimbursement by state DOT and state police for their use and occupation of the RTOC on Scottsville Road.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you again on the same page. I think perhaps this is applied elsewhere, but again, why do interdepartmental charges continue to decrease over the last 4 budget cycles? Is this to your answer, Mr. Franklin, earlier, that this is a new, just a better way of budgeting? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, if the question is why has it declined over the past 4 budgets?
Yes, sir.
I'm probably not prepared tonight to answer that question. I'll have to look at that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on page 342, we talked, there was 2018 a particularly high year for stakeout requests resolved? Is that a fair assessment?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the number of stakeouts that we resolve, yes, those are called in by various users of the right-of-way, and that can include the city of Rochester. There's been a few very intensive projects that required a lot of stakeouts, particularly the Interloop and others that were going on, and that's where a lot of the signal equipment is that we stake out. So it is a projection, and depending on the scale of the projects, it could vary.
And through you, Mr. Chairman, do we see in 2020 any particular projects that would potentially increase that?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, not at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Legislator Lightfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 follow-up questions on that, and then I'll move forward. Lastly, we just talked about stakeouts being resolved. Through you, Mr. Chairman, our stakeout requests, do we have someone dedicated to do stakeout requests, or is that something that we just do at fly? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the stakeout requests come through the stakeout, the 511, and those are called in, and we are part of the notification system. They come to the RTOC, and our signal folks go out and stake out the conduit runs at the particular intersections that are requested, and subsequently closed out through the system as well. So there's
Correct. So
whole system.
I'm familiar with the youth pole, Mr. Chairman. And so the reason I'm asking that is because that 511 is called daily by multiple agencies or people with their own homes who want to put in a gazebo. I mean, so are we saying we don't have anyone dedicated to that? I mean, I don't understand why it's in the budget to be a high frequency of being resolved when it's something that should be part of the daily practice. That's what I'm asking, Mr. Chairman, through you.
The youth boat system requires us to respond to those. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. The youth boat system requires us to respond, so some of those may be very simple response if there's no signal system or conduit in that particular area. Others require our field people to go out and actually perform the stakeout.
Okay, so we're putting that into the budget on page 342. No worries, I'll follow up on that because I missed that one in the budget. Just to go back to page 339 to you, Mr. Chairman, as my colleague had already asked about the new process that we're doing where chargebacks are eliminated, and there's a change in practice. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the administration. For a very long time, we used chargebacks as a way to identify line items in our budget. However, at this particular time, you believe that this isn't the most efficient way to do so. And through you, Mr. Chairman, to the administration, through you, Mr. Chairman, to the administration, what do we believe to be? Why don't we believe this to be the best practice anymore?
Mr. Chairman, from an accounting standpoint, I like to accumulate all the cost of a discrete project within one particular capital fund. That really gives us a good measure of what it really does cost to build a bridge. However, Mr. Chairman, part of our cost of building that bridge is internal staff time. That internal staff time is already accounted for in the annual operating budget of the county. To now basically tax for our internal operating cost, only to later charge them to a capital fund, is not necessarily the best practice, because it no longer is relevant for us to accumulate all the cost of a capital project. It's not like we're trying to price out our services for resale. Rather, we're only trying to borrow for a capital project for those costs not already accounted for. And I don't want to be in a situation where this county could be borrowing for payroll.
Thank you so much. I guess I just as a comment, Mr. Chairman, is, for years I believed the same thing, but yet we had this practice for so many years, especially for the 8 years I've been here, which really didn't make sense. That's just my comment on that. Through you, Mr. Chairman, we'll continue to move on. I'll go back to the stakeout request. I'm not necessarily satisfied with that. However, I have not gathered all the information. Some of my staff members or another colleague have identified that within the budget. So through the administration, through you, Mr. Chairman, the administration should prepare themselves for more questioning on that particular question, as I'm very aware of what stakeouts were, because that's what I did for the Department of Environmental Services. So I'm looking for an exact answer, period. Let me move on to page 343, if I will, if I can, Mr. Chairman, to the administration. Bridge engineering and operations. And through you, Mr. Chairman, we won't be much longer. Not that you're worried about it, but just to share with my colleagues. Page 343. Why do we predict only $50,000 interdepartmental charge? Okay, so why did we predict only a $50,000 interdepartmental charge when the previous year's actual was amended to be over $200,000?
Mr. Chairman, the detail of our interdepartmental charges can be found on page 569 of the budget book. And the $50,634 is an accumulation of a variety of areas, including charge for our unemployment insurance, liability insurance, our risk management, county IS service chargebacks, fleet maintenance chargebacks, and just a little bit of chargeback from our own print shop. Those chargebacks amount to $50,634. 2019 amended budget also has that variety of charges. However, it also included a negative $355,000 for project chargebacks. That would have been the operating chargeback to a variety of capital funds. By eliminating that project chargebacks, the net effect is an increase in interdepartmental charges amounting to $50,634.
Thank you. I see here in the budget as a, you said 350,000, I saw it as a 286,000. But no worries on that. Thank you for the concept. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I have a question. What is the, through you, Mr. Chairman, the appropriated fund balance on page 343?
Mr. Chairman, in the bridge engineering and operations, our use of appropriate fund balance is specifically associated with our reserve for bonded debt to very specific capital funds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other questions? Well, gentlemen, thank you for your questions. Mr. Franklin, thank you for all the answers.
I would like to thank Mr. Franklin for his work, particularly as it comes to the Transportation Committee and to the entire Transportation team for everything that they've done to prepare the budget. So I would like to thank you guys for all of your hard work. I know this isn't an easy process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll now go on. The next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. You have the July 23rd, 2019 minutes of the Transportation Committee before you. They will stand approved unless the check clerk is notified of any changes by the end of the day.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, on that note, I would like to note that it references that I myself was absent for that committee. I was, however, here in the chambers, so if
We'll
that
make
could
that
be
correction.
corrected. Thank you very much, Mr.
Just not
Chairman.
here in spirit, huh? You were actually
I
here.
was here physically. I went back and reviewed the tape, so
Okay.
I was here for the meeting.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is new business. Mr. Clerk,
Referral 19-0288.
moved by legislator Hebert, seconded by legislator Zale. Is there any questions? Legislator Hebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the administration, why did these project costs exceed the original expectations?
Through the chair, this is a very small spot improvement project and in a very busy corridor on Ridgeway Avenue, just west of 390. Overall, the reason for that is our unit prices are higher as a result of that. Very small project and very limited production in what we're trying to do in terms of the widening. So as I looked at the costs, they were spread across all the particular items, and as a result, the overall project cost, for even though it's a small project, were higher.
Thank you. Through the chairman, what's the timeline for this project? What was it?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the award will be made this spring, pending approval from this body, and moving forward, it'll be constructed probably within about 90 days during the early summer to midsummer timeframe in 2020.
Thank you, sir.
Are there any other questions? Legislator Lightfoot.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the administration, is Keeler Construction a MWBE company?
Through you, Mr. Chair, they are a union contractor, but not an MWBE. They will be providing the minority quotas that are, the goals rather, that are required as part of the contract, and working with our compliance team to make sure that those are met.
Thank you.
Any further questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The referral passes. Mr. Clerk.
Referral 19-0289.
Moved by legislator Zale, seconded by legislator Rockow. Are there any questions? Legislator Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the administration, could we just get a little bit of a work timeline for this particular project? Most importantly, when it's coming through the town of Arundecoy?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, this particular project, the Highway Lighting North project, is just beginning design. We have solicited the consultant already, and they are on board. We're expecting the design report next month, scheduled for construction in 2021.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chairman, will the $350,000 be appropriated in the Capital Fund 1908?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't have the capital funds, but yes, we do have a capital fund set up for this sole project. If 1908 is the number, that would be correct.
Okay.
I don't have that in front of me.
That's
I
okay.
could certainly, pardon?
Mr.
Through you, Mr.
Franklin
Chair,
said
yes,
it's
it is. It
Okay.
is 1908.
Perfect, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Any further questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, the referral passes.
Referral 19-0290.
Moved by legislator Racco, seconded by legislator Hebert. Any questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, the referral passes.
Referral 19-0304.
Moved by legislator Hebert, seconded by legislator Zale. Any questions? Legislator Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one question on 1903, 0304, 305, and 306. My question is the same for all three of those, which is, has the construction for these projects begun?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, no, these are currently in design.
Okay, and that goes for, through you, Mr. Chairman, for all three of those, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, the referral passes.
Referral 19-0305.
Moved by legislator Zale, seconded by legislator Rocco. Any questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, referral passes.
Referral 19-0306.
Moved by legislator Rocco, seconded by legislator Zale. Any questions? Legislator Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the administration, is the county expecting to acquire interests for this project via contract or eminent domain?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, until the preliminary engineering is done and the need for easements are identified, I cannot answer that whether or not. If it does need to be acquired, it will be acquired through the proper channels because this is federal aid and needs to follow all the procedures.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chairman, what is the current funding amount in the 2019 operating budget for this work?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, this is a capital project, so through the operating, nothing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, the referral passes.
Last item, referral 19-0308.
Moved by legislator Hibbert, seconded by legislator Zale. Are there any questions? There being none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, the referral passes. That's the end of our referrals. Are there any other matters to come before this committee? Legislator Racco.
I'd like to thank you for your dedication and service as a chairman for this committee. You and I came in together, and when they chose you to be the transportation, your chairman, your background with the city of Rochester and Public Works was a great choice, and thank you for chairing this, and wish you well.
Well, thank you, Legislator Racco. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I've seen you put the work that you put in, and we're leaving on a good note, I think. We're both happy with the accomplishments that we've had. Legislator Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could just echo my colleagues' comments. Thank you for your dedication to not only the Transportation Committee, but to the county legislature as a whole. We're certainly a better community for your service, and you'll certainly be missed in these chambers. But again, from all of us on this side of the aisle, and I'm sure it's echoed across the hall, across the aisle, we certainly thank you for your time here, and we wish you the best.
Well, thank you very much. And I will certainly be looking forward to seeing what goes on next year, even though I'm no longer a part of it.
We look forward to keeping you up to date.
Okay, there being no other matters, the November 26, 2019 meeting of the Transportation Committee stands adjourned. The next meeting of the Transportation Committee will be announced.